As you can see, we're going to continue our series of overviews of books of the Bible this evening, and we've come to the end of what is called the major prophets. That is the 5 first books of prophecy that we have in the Old Testament. And so that brings us to the book of Daniel. Now, just up front about the book of Daniel here, this is a reminder, this is an overview sermon, as all of them have been. And so there's lots of things in the book of Daniel that I know you probably cherish. There's some of the most well-known Bible stories in all the Bible are found in the book of Daniel. There's lots of parts that are fun to preach, that are interesting to preach. And I would love to get sidetracked and talk about those stories at length, but because we're doing an overview, we're not going to do that. So we're not going to dive down into all of the depth and details of these stories. But I hope that if you haven't studied Daniel in a while, that maybe you'll take this as a foundation to go and do some more study on your own. And then also as we get to the end of Daniel, where we have several of the visions and prophecies, I'm going to cover them very briefly, just like the stories. I'm not going to get into a lot of the interpretation because, one, it is an overview sermon, and two, because I'll admit to you, I don't know all of the answers. There are some challenging prophecies in this book, but it is nonetheless a wonderful and an encouraging and an exciting book. And so I look forward to going over that with you this evening, and I hope that all of us benefit from this overview in some way. When we get to the book of Daniel, the book is a very unique book in several ways. Some ways we don't see in our English Bibles, but one of the ways that it's very unique, and this has caused some consternation and debate amongst commentators, it's, as far as I know, one of the only books in the Bible that's written in 2 different languages. Parts of the book are written in Hebrew, and then parts of the book are written in Aramaic. And so why it was written that way, people have all sorts of ideas about, but most of the books of prophecy, most of the books of the Old Testament aren't that way. They're pretty much all written in Hebrew. So Daniel was written differently for some reason. In the Hebrew Bible, it's actually included, the Hebrew Bible is organized a little bit different than our English translations organize the Old Testament. And you have the law or of Moses, the Torah, you have the prophets, and you have the writings. And the writings include more of the books of poetry and such. And Daniel is actually included in the writings, not in the books of prophecy. Now, in our translations, we include Daniel, or in English, we include it because he is a prophet and there are prophetic visions. But when you think about how Daniel delivered his prophecy, it is very different compared to most of the other prophets. Jeremiah's prophecy is written down, but you can tell reading through Jeremiah that by and large, Jeremiah was speaking his prophecies to the people. He was preaching to the nation. Ezekiel was giving messages to the people. He would receive visions and messages that he was to then go and give to the people. Most of the prophets received words that then they preached to the people. But Daniel is very different, one, because his visions are different than some of the others in many ways, but also he's really not a prophet to Judah and to Israel. Now, there are things in his prophecy that concern Judah and Israel, but he has prophecies and he interprets visions and dreams that have to do with the world, and not just judgment and destruction on Edom or on the Philistines, but he reveals world history. He's interpreting dreams for Nebuchadnezzar. He's interacting with world leaders. And so it's a very different focus than much of the other prophets of the Old Testament. And he's not really preaching them out as warnings like Ezekiel and Jeremiah and Isaiah and many of the other prophets. Sometimes it's hard to tell if he really spoke about these dreams or visions to anybody other than interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dreams or Belshazzar's seeing the handwriting on the wall. It seems that he was mainly a writing prophet, and that's part of why the Hebrews originally put his works in the writings instead of in the books of prophecy. Not that he wasn't a prophet, but the method it was delivered was different. So Daniel is just in many ways a very unique book, and it's of course very unique because of the stories that are told in it and the visions that he sees. That's, again, other than Jonah, he's really the only book of prophecy in the Old Testament that is mostly narrative. The first 6 chapters of Daniel, while it includes interpreting dreams and visions are told in narrative story format. That's why the first part of Daniel is fun and easy to read, because it's in stories. And then the latter half is focused more on vision. So that's unique. It's a very, very unique book, but it's also a very powerful book and very interesting book in many ways. Now, of course, as we talk about the author, that is Daniel. It's named after him. He's the main character. There's some big, big characters in the book of Daniel, but he's the constant. He's the one that everything focuses on in this book, and he is the author. That's debated, of course. Things are always debated amongst different scholars that like to question everything. But Daniel claims to have written this book later on in the book itself, and so we can just stick with that. But who was Daniel? We don't know a whole lot about Daniel, but we do know that he was carried off into captivity during the first wave of exile. If you remember, as we've talked about it, there were 3 different waves of exile. The first one being roughly around 605 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar carried a few people and some of the elements of the Jerusalem temple back to Babylon. And Daniel appears to be in that first group. And many commentators believe that he was probably, if he was not a part of the royal family, was a part of what would be considered the nobility. Because when you read in chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, it tells about the depart or the exile during Jehoiakim's reign, and it says that Nebuchadnezzar left instructions for the commanders to bring back elements from the Lord's house, the temple, and also to bring back some of the royal family and the nobility. Basically, this was taking what would be considered the cream of the crop. This was a tactic to try and get the leadership and the nobility, the ones who were the most wealthy, to get them out. That makes it less likely that who is left is going to be able to really revolt. Of course, Nebuchadnezzar would have to come back 2 more times before he finally just decimated and destroyed the city. But they would take the royalty and the nobility out, and then they would assimilate them into their own culture typically. And we'll see that in chapter 1. And so Daniel and his friend Shadrach, who get the name Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're all very young at this time, probably teenagers, if maybe not even a little bit younger, when they are carried off into captivity in that first wave of exile. And so hopefully this shows up okay. I think this is from James Smith's commentary, and that's not our James Smith. That is James E. Smith, the Old Testament commentator, but this is from his commentary, kind of a timeline of Daniel's life. And he lived not only a long life, but a very long prophetic career. We read about his departure, again, roughly 605, 604 BC. He lives throughout the entire 70-year time period of the captivity, and the latter dates that he gives in Cyrus and Darius's reign would take him somewhere around the year 530, or maybe even a little bit later. And so what we have recorded is at least a 75 plus year life just in exile and captivity that's recorded in the Bible. So he lived to be a man probably in his 90s, or at least into his late 80s. So he lived a fairly long life, and we get to read about quite a large swath of it, even though it's just little bits here and there that is recorded for us in this book. Now, but beyond that, we don't know a lot about Daniel. We're not given a lot of other historical information. One interesting point I will bring up, though, is he is mentioned in a couple other places, but one of them is in the book we went over last, and that was in Ezekiel. And there were a couple of times where God is telling Ezekiel that basically judgment it's coming. The final judgment, the destruction of Jerusalem, it's going to happen. And he even says, if Job and Daniel, and I forget the third man's name off the top of my head, but he says, if they were there, I still would destroy the city. They couldn't fix this problem. And when you think about that, Daniel was a fairly young man. He had been in captivity not very long, maybe 10 to 20 years, when Ezekiel was writing those things. So he's still a fairly young man, and he had already proven himself to be so faithful that he earns a spot next to some of the greatest men in the Bible and is recognized as a righteous and faithful man. Later on, we won't get to be able to go into the details, but one of the things that's just kind of touching and incredible is when Gabriel and the angelic messengers come to Daniel. Sometimes they come and they tell him they are coming to give him understanding because he is highly loved, because he is highly favored. This man was an incredible example of faithfulness and devotion to God. And I read one commentator made the point that he is one of the very few Bible characters that we read about that nothing negative is written about Daniel. That doesn't mean he never sinned. It doesn't mean he didn't have faults, but none of them were recorded for us in the Bible. Now, we read about David, a man after God's own heart, and we read about his faults. We read about Abraham, and we read about his lies. We read about Moses and how he struck the rock when he was commanded to speak to it. Most everybody in the Bible we read about, we also hear some of their faults. But Daniel, God didn't put any of Daniel's faults in the scriptures for us to read about. And so he was a very impressive man indeed. But as far as the outline of the book, when we go through these books, I like to try and provide an outline. And I'm going to admit to you, this is as simple as it gets of an outline. And that's not because there's not more complex ideas out there. If you read some commentaries about Daniel, you'll find some really elaborate, kind of interesting, but some very elaborate outlines that are based on chiastic structure. And if you don't know what that means, that's perfectly okay. That's why we're sticking with the simple outline. There's some neat things, but the easiest way to divide up the book of Daniel is the first part, chapters 1 through 6, are stories. And when I say stories, I don't mean fairy tales. Stories can be real, they can be true, and these ones are true. And then chapters 7 through 12 are visions. So you notice I have up here this idea of faithfulness and sovereignty. We'll come back to those ideas as two of the primary core themes of the book of Daniel that are demonstrated through these two sections. And so those first 6 chapters, I would say, are stories of faithfulness and sovereignty. And then chapters 7 through 12 are visions and prophecies of faithfulness and sovereignty. And I'll explain those themes a bit more as we go through. Hopefully you'll see them, and then we'll talk about them at the end. But let's just dive in, and we're going to go, there's 12 chapters. We're basically going to go chapter by chapter, not in detail, but just to kind of mark what takes place, and we'll build off of that. So as we get into these stories of faithfulness and sovereignty, the first chapter is not the most well-known of the book of Daniel, but it's a fairly well-known story and an important one. As I mentioned, Daniel was carried off, and he was very young at this time, but he's carried off with some of the royal family and the nobility, and they are brought to Babylon. Also, Nebuchadnezzar wanted those who were the best looking, who had proven to be some of the smartest. Basically, he wants the best of the best, and he's going to put them to work in his kingdom. He's going to take the best and brightest and make them part of his rulership. Now, that's not going to give them necessarily a lot of authority, especially to start off with, but it really is a good plan if you think about it. If you're conquering the world and you have all these people subject, instead of just massacring all of the best and brightest of the peoples you conquer, you make them come and work for you, and then you benefit as your kingdom grows. But to do that, you need to assimilate them. You don't want them to really hold on to their original identity. You want them to become, in this case, Babylonian as much as possible. And so they are renamed. They're given new names. Daniel is given the name Belteshazzar. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are actually the Babylonian names that are given to those men when they are moved there. But part of the training program is they're educated for 3 years, these young men, and they are supposed to be fed the way the king wants his people fed, and they're supposed to practice these customs. But we might think this is strange, but these men have it pretty well off when you think about it. I mean, they're not suffering in a refugee camp like Ezekiel will do later on. They're not starving in a besieged city of Jerusalem like Jeremiah and others will do at some point. They are in the palace, and they have the opportunity to eat the king food and get the best education and basically have a pretty plush lifestyle. It will be a life of work for the king, but it will be a pretty plush lifestyle for a conquered people. But there's a problem. To eat the king's food and to drink the king's wine is going to make them do some things that, as good Jews, they shouldn't do. The king's diet surely includes some things that are considered unclean and unholy for a faithful Jew to eat. And the wine is probably something they should not be partaking of. And so Daniel and his friends, they ask for an exemption, that they eat something different, that they eat vegetables and drink water. Now, God had blessed them, much like Joseph when he was in Potiphar's house or when he was in the prison. We're told that God had blessed Daniel and his friends and that they found favor in the sight of the man that's over them. And this man wants to help them, but he's worried if he feeds these Hebrews vegetables and water and they look sickly and thin and kind of less than all these other people, they're going to get in trouble. And he's going to get in trouble. And when you get in trouble with Nebuchadnezzar, what that means is a violent and painful death. And so he doesn't really want to do that. But they talk to him and they ask him, give us some time, give us a certain amount of days. You let us eat our diet, and you let all these other people eat their diet and compare us. So he does. And God blesses them. And at the end of this period of time, Daniel and his friends, they look even healthier and more attractive and better than these people that are eating from the king's diet. And so they are allowed to eat what they've requested. Now, that may seem like a small story. Why in the world is that such a big deal? Well, there's a couple of reasons it's a big deal. One, because this whole thing, this diet and this training, all of this, it is aimed at assimilating them into Babylonian culture. And they refuse to forget that they are the people of God. Now, a lot of people might think God didn't save me. God let me be carried off as a captive. God didn't save Jerusalem. Why should I be loyal to that? But Daniel and his friends are faithful and loyal even in a difficult circumstance. Secondly, I think it's important that the story starts off, these are young men, and they make a difficult choice very early on that proves to be the foundation for even more, what we might think of as more difficult choices later on. We know the story of what? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. We know the story of Daniel and the lion's den. And we think of those stories and we think of the courage. But, think of what happens at the furnace. Those men refuse to bow down and worship an image. By this point in Israel's history, it's gotten, the point has pretty well become clear, you don't commit idolatry. And as difficult as the choice would be when it's either bow down to this idol or be put to death, that's a big extreme thing. I hope that most of us, and maybe we don't know until if we were put into the situation, but I think we at least understand when your choice is face death or deny God or bow down to this idol, it's a tough choice. But there's a clear choice that you should make. When Daniel's told later, you can't pray unless you pray to Darius, we all know that would be completely wrong, even if it means facing the worst consequences. But back up to where it starts. What if your choice is, it's not worship this false god, it's not quit praying to Yahweh, it's eat this food. That, by the way, I'm going to be honest, probably sounded a lot better than vegetables and water. And what's the big deal about eating the king's meat and maybe some pork and this wine that everybody else is doing? Is that really that big of a deal? Think of how easy it would have been for Daniel and his friends to bend just a little bit, to assimilate just a hair, but they wouldn't. I think one of the lessons that Daniel 1 teaches us is that being faithful in the small things is what builds a foundation to being faithful in the big things. Why were these men the type that grew to the day when they were told you're going to be thrown in the fire and they said, go for it? Why could Daniel, when he's older, say, you're going to be thrown to the lions if you pray to this man? Say, that's perfectly fine, because this started a long time ago when they made smaller decisions of faithfulness over things like food. Every single day, we have little decisions, little temptations, little things that face us. And it's what we do day by day with those little things that will matter when that time comes that we have to make a big choice and a big decision. We see that here in Daniel. Well, then we forward a little bit, and we're told the story in Daniel chapter 2 about a dream. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream one night, and he wakes up, and this has, it's kind of reminiscent of Pharaoh, another world leader who has to use one of God's people to interpret a dream. But there's an interesting twist here in this dream. Nebuchadnezzar was a very clever man. He's very smart. And he has this dream, and he can tell it's not just a normal dream. There's an interpretation to this dream, but he doesn't know what it is, so he wants it interpreted. But he apparently is quite suspicious of these mages. And so instead of saying, here's my dream, what does it mean? He says, I had a dream and I need to know its interpretation. And the mages all say, well, what was the dream? And he says, you tell me. If you're able to interpret dreams, then you should be able to tell me what the dream was. And they say, no one can do that. And he said, how about this? You tell me the dream and its interpretation, or I'll kill all of you violently. They say, we can't do it. So he starts rounding them up, and he's ready to execute them. And Daniel sends message to the king. He says, don't do this. God will make it known. And so Daniel is brought before the king, and he tells Nebuchadnezzar what he dreamed. And he tells him about this great statue that he dreamed of. And it was a very strange statue because it was made of different types of metal. There's a head that's made of gold, and there's the chest and the arms are made of silver, and the belly or the stomach and the thighs are made of bronze, and then the legs are made of iron, and the feet are iron mixed with clay. And he saw this great and this magnificent but multi-material statue, but then he also saw from this mountain a rock that is cut out, but it's not cut out with a human hand. It's very clearly something that is divine action. And this rock is hurled, or it rolls against this statue, and it crushes this statue. And that's what he dreamed. And this is what Daniel tells him. And you have to imagine Nebuchadnezzar at this point is paying attention, because he thought all of these people were charlatans, and they all were except for this man. He could tell him the dream. And thus he had the authority to tell him what it meant, because this dream was actually from God. And he tells him, God has chosen to reveal to you the future. And this actually comes into play later in one of Daniel's others. Again, we're not going to get down into the details, but just a quick rundown. He tells what we see, and we see this by comparing it with the other visions, but he does tell him, he says that these are 4 kingdoms. These are different kings and kingdoms. He says, you are the head of gold. But your kingdom's not going to last. And it's going to be taken over at some point by another kingdom. And they're not going to be quite as glorious as you. Silver is really nice, but it's not quite as nice as gold. But then there's going to be another kingdom that supplants them. And then there's going to be another kingdom, and it's going to be a ferocious kingdom. It's going to rule the world like someone with a rod of iron, someone that's destructive and dangerous and forceful. And there's going to be all these kings of this kingdom. But in the times of those kings, this rock that was hewn out without hands, it is going to come on the scene. And it is going to there's going to be a new kingdom established that will be an eternal and an everlasting kingdom. Of course, that refers to Jesus and his kingdom and the church. But he explains this great scene to Nebuchadnezzar. Well, then we go to another story, and it may seem unrelated, but I do think they're connected, because we come to a story, and Nebuchadnezzar was blown away. He was excited. He promotes Daniel, but Nebuchadnezzar seems to be one of those men that, as smart as he was, he also had to learn things multiple times before they really sunk in. And so Daniel clearly is speaking for God. He's able to tell him the dream. He tells him the interpretation, and the interpretation was clear. You are the head of gold, but one day your kingdom is going to be supplanted by another. What does Nebuchadnezzar decide to do? At some point later, we're told that he builds a statue, and it's a massive statue. I can't remember. You calculate out how big it would be. I want to say it was around 90 feet tall or something. It was a huge statue made of gold, the whole thing. Why do you think he did that? We're not told specifically, but it seems odd to me that he hears a dream that there is a statue, a huge statue with a head of gold that represents him, and he decides to go build a huge statue made all of gold. He's in charge. He doesn't want this nonsense about other kingdoms coming that aren't his. He wants to be the great one. And so he makes this huge statue, all of gold. Of course, this is a story that we all know well. He brings all of the leaders and the governors and all of the people that he can to this statue on this plain, and they play this music, and they're given the command, when you hear the music, you're going to bow down to this great image. And they play all the music, and everybody bows down, but there's three guys that are standing, and they're not going to bow down to the image, and of course, that's these three Hebrews. There's some people that apparently may have been bowing down, but also had their eyes towards these men because they see them, and they go and they report and they tell Nebuchadnezzar they didn't bow down, and he brings them. And to Nebuchadnezzar's credit, he doesn't just try and kill them right off. Whether he liked these men, whether he just saw their value, whether he recognized these others, were probably envious and jealous, he gives them another chance. I don't think that's because Nebuchadnezzar was just known for his grace and mercy. But he probably realized something's going on here. So he's going to give these guys another chance. He says, all right, I'm going to play the music again. Everyone's going to bow down, and you're going to bow down. And as long as you do that, everything will be okay. He says, but I want you to know, and I'm paraphrasing here, please go back and read chapter 3. He says, I want you to know that if you don't bow down, I will throw you in the fiery furnace. And he even asks the question, he says, and who is the Lord? Who is the God that will deliver you from my hand? He apparently had forgotten about the great power of the one who had shown him that vision and empowered Daniel to know and interpret the vision. His arrogance has been built up again, and their response is incredible. They simply say, we don't even need to answer you. They say, our God is able to deliver us. Yahweh is able. That's who can deliver us. They also say, but he doesn't have to. And if he chooses not to, that's his will. But we will not bow down. What incredible faith. The strongest man in the world, one of the most powerful rulers that has ever lived in world history. And they don't care. Because he is not God. And they will not disobey God to appease this man. Of course, he goes into a rage. He commands that the fires be heated up. It says 7 times their normal heat, whether that is a literal rendering or whether that was just a way of saying, get it as hot as you possibly can. It's so hot that when the guards throw these men in, the heat kills those guards. But of course, they're thrown in. And Nebuchadnezzar's watching, and all of a sudden he sees 4 men in the fire. He can tell the 4th is not just a normal person. So he calls to them, and they come out. And the ropes have burned off, but nothing else is burned. Nothing is singed. You can't even smell smoke on them. And this time Nebuchadnezzar is humbled. And he confesses the greatness of the one true God of Israel, of Yahweh. He makes a law that anybody that speaks against this God is going to face judgment and death. What a wonderful day it is for God's people. But he has to learn the hard way still. Because we get to the end of chapter 3 and you think, man, here is Nebuchadnezzar confessing the greatness of God. And then we get to chapter 4 and he has another dream. And no one can interpret this one. It doesn't seem he puts everyone through the ringer this time. He tells them, but no one can interpret it. They're honest with him. They know better than to lie to him. And so they get Daniel before him again. And he tells Daniel this dream. He dreamed of this massive tree, the tree that reached all the way up into the heavens, and birds and living creatures were able to make their home in it. And it was so big that everywhere in the world could look and see this tree. But then a holy one, a messenger from heaven, is heard speaking, and they say, chop down the tree, but leave a stump. And he can tell it's a troubling dream, and so he asks Daniel, and Daniel is incredibly respected. It seems that Daniel truly had a respect for Nebuchadnezzar, because he says, oh, king, I wish this were an interpretation for your enemies. But then he tells him it's not. He says, the tree is you. You're that tree. He was great and high. He's the ruler of the world, basically. But he says, you're going to be humbled. And he says, you're going to be driven from the presence of man. for 7 periods of time, and that's debated whether that's 7 days, 7 weeks, 7 years. He says, you're going to live like an ox that eats grass. You're going to live like an animal. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't go into a fit of rage. He says, thanks for the interpretation. And then we're told about a year later, I'm sure it shook him for a while, but then we're told 12 months later, so a year later, he's around his palace. He's looking out over his kingdom, and he starts congratulating himself on all that he has built and all that he has done and all the glory he has amassed for himself. And he hears a proclamation. Everything Daniel said came true. Basically, he goes mad. He's not able to live with people. And this is a very strange story. There's a lot of opinions about it. But essentially, his hair grows out. He's like a wild animal for a period of time. But then the end of that chapter, his sanity returns. He's restored to his kingdom. And I've always thought this is amazing. I encourage you to go. I want to read it right now, but for time's sake, I'm going to have you read it instead. But verses 34 through 37 are Nebuchadnezzar's words. There's a piece of trivia for you. Did you know that Nebuchadnezzar wrote part of the Bible? Whether he wrote them or he dictated them to Daniel, verses 34 through 37 are from the perspective of Nebuchadnezzar. And he admits the glory of God. He admits that God is alone in control. Finally, he learns his lesson. And that's where the story of Nebuchadnezzar in the Bible ends. I'd love to say more about that, but we must hasten on. Chapter 5, unfortunately, some of his descendants didn't learn that lesson. Chapter 5 is a very well-known story. This is Belshazzar, the last king, the last ruler of the Babylonian people. We're introduced to a point, and by this point, Daniel would be a pretty old man. But Belshazzar throws a feast. It's a drinking feast. All of his people are getting drunk and committing gluttony. And he specifically requests for the vessels of gold and silver from the temple to be brought in. And they drink from these golden vessels and these silver vessels that used to be used in the temple of God's worship back in Jerusalem. And they're praising their pagan and foreign gods. And all of a sudden, Benny may have chalked it up to the drunkenness, but Belshazzar realizes it's not a drunken hallucination. He sees this hand. How terrifying would that be to just see a hand writing on the wall? He doesn't know what it means. Somebody there remembers this old man Daniel that was highly respected in Nebuchadnezzar's reign. They call Daniel and they ask him, they say, can you tell us what it means? And he makes all these promises. And Daniel is much less flattering to Belshazzar than he ever was to Nebuchadnezzar. You can see a very different attitude. But he tells him what it means. There's these words, this mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. And he says, and here's what it means, the word mene. God has numbered your days, and judgment is coming. Tekel means you have been weighed in the balances and you have been found wanting. That is lacking. Then Paris, your kingdom is divided and it is given to the Medes and the Persians. You want to know what that's why we have that phrase, the handwriting on the wall. It means the end. That's what God was saying to Belshazzar. So you have this interesting chapters 4 and 5. You have the humbling of two arrogant kings. Nebuchadnezzar learned. That night, Belshazzar died as his kingdom fell to the Medo-Persian Empire, and the Babylonian kingdom of gold transferred over to the kingdom of silver that Daniel had prophesied about via that dream so long ago. And then, of course, chapter 6, I'm just going to mention this because we only have a few minutes left, and I do want to at least mention the prophecies. Of course, we have the chapter of Daniel and the lion's den, and I'm sure I don't need to say anything to cover that story. Probably haven't needed to some of these other stories, but you know the story well of Daniel's faith and God's deliverance of Daniel, even though he was cast into that den of lions, and the evil men that tried to oppose him were the ones that suffered judgment. But then we come to the last section, and from Daniel, Daniel's 1 through 6 are pretty well known. You know all of those, or at least most of those stories very well. Daniel 7 through 12, hardly any of us know, myself included, very well. But these are important chapters. I'm going to at least highlight them, and maybe we can study these further at another time. But there are several visions that Daniel receives. In chapter 7, we're told of a vision of different beasts. And this is a very strange sounding vision, but Daniel sees this. He's by these waters, and he sees these beasts coming up out of the sea. He sees this lion with eagle's wings. Followed by that, there is this bear that is higher on one side than the other, and there's 3 ribs in its teeth. Then there's this leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings. And then there's this terrifying beast. We don't know what it is, just called a terrifying beast with iron teeth and 10 horns. And this is a very strange sounding dream, but what this is this is essentially the same vision as what God had shown Nebuchadnezzar. This is representative of the kingdoms of the earth that are going to be rising over the next several centuries. But Daniel also sees, while these beasts are rising out, he sees what he calls the Ancient of Days. And he sees one that's likened to a son of man. This is where the title Son of Man becomes messianic, because he says this one, like the Son of Man, approaches the Ancient of Days, and the Ancient of Days, God, gives him a dominion. He gives him a kingdom that is an everlasting kingdom. The Son of Man receives what that stone symbolized that destroyed these other kingdoms and was an everlasting kingdom. And so Daniel is seeing this again in this type of vision. And then, Daniel asks about the 4th beast especially, and there's more explained, but at the end, it's the same point, and that is that the saints inherit the eternal kingdom. Well, from this, Daniel 8 then focuses on one aspect of that Medo-Persian Empire and what would be the Greek Empire, in another vision that comes a little bit later. This vision happens in the 3rd year of Belshazzar. I think that other one came in the 1st year of Belshazzar, but you can check me on that. But he sees this vision, and he sees this ram, and it's got these 2 horns, but one horn is bigger than the other. But then he sees this goat, this he-goat, coming from the west, and this ram is going to the north and the east and the south. But there's this angry goat that's rushing. In fact, it's going so fast it's not even touching the ground, and it has a prominent horn in between its eyes. So it's almost like a unicorn of a goat, but it's running in the air at an amazing speed from the west, and it strikes this ram and it kills the ram. But then this horn ends up breaking, and 4 more horns take its place, and one of them is a little horn that becomes very powerful and very evil as well. And Gabriel, the angel Gabriel, is sent, and he explains this, at least part of it, and he tells him that this represents the history that's going to unfold. The ram would be the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, this is given in the 3rd year of Belshazzar's reign, so the Persians have not conquered Babylon yet. They're getting ready to. And he says the ram represents the Medo-Persian Empire, and the goat represents Greece, the Grecian kingdom. And you can fill in the history. And by the way, it fits this prophecy exactly. There was one Greek that caused this, and that was Alexander the Great. I know this is kind of a corny joke, but everybody likes to talk about the GOAT. Is it LeBron James or Michael Jordan or Tom Brady or Mahomes? Literally, the GOAT is Alexander the Great. He is not the greatest of all time, but he is the GOAT of the vision here. So we can settle that debate. But he's the horn when we read through history. And by the way, when he died at a fairly young age, he didn't have a son. He didn't have someone that came up. There were 4 men that basically divided up that Greek kingdom and fought within each other. And we saw 4 horns. And history continues to play out from there. Then on chapter 9, so we've had these visions, but chapter 9, we're introduced to, and we can't go in depth about this because there's so much there, but this is the 70 weeks prophecy. And there's a few things that are important. This happens in the 1st year of Darius. And then also we're introduced, many people jump right to the prophecy, but it's important to notice that at the first part of chapter 9, Daniel is praying. And he said that he had been considering Jeremiah's prophecy about the 70-year captivity. He had figured out that it's time to go home. It's been 70 years. And he's praying about this, and he's praying about the Lord's sanctuary. He sees that things are not the way that they ought to be, even amongst his people. And he confesses the sins of the nation. He confesses his sins. And he's praying to God about this. And God answers him by sending an angel. He sends Gabriel, I believe, is named in the chapter again. And he's told that from the moment that he started his message, he had been sent to come and to comfort and to instruct Daniel. And so it's in response to that prayer that the 70 weeks prophecy is given. And just to kind of go over it, Gabriel talks about 70 weeks, literally 77s. That's why it's considered weeks. Think of 7 days in the week. And he divides it up into 3 time periods. He said there's going to be 7 weeks. And then he says, and then there will be a 62-week period. So that would give us 69 of those weeks. And he says at that point, and the anointed one will be cut off. And then he mentions that at half of the week, there will be put an end to sacrifice and offering. And maybe someday I'll try and study some of these further. There's a lot of debate. Some people think that this ended in the Maccabean period before Jesus was born. Many people think that the prophecy finds its fulfillment with the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And then your dispensationalists that believe in the rapture and a literal 1,000-year reign in the future think that we're still in that last half-week period yet, and the prophecy is not yet finished. I don't think that's accurate or true, but that's just a quick overview of the chapter. We don't have time to go any further to that, but you can go and read some of that and do some study. And then chapters 10 through 12 kind of all work together of visions of the future. We aren't going to delve into them, but basically you see this mighty king, you see violent battles, you see a very troublesome time, especially for God's people. But we also see that God's people win in the end. Also, at the end of Daniel, I wanted to read this, but for time's sake, I'm not going to. But go read the last chapter of Daniel. And something interesting happens. Daniel wants to understand, and so much has been explained to him. But the angel finally tells Daniel, he says, these things are shut up, they're sealed up for the end of times. But I do want to go ahead and read the last verse. Basically, he says, these things are sealed up. Some of these things can't be known. Some of these things aren't going to be known for a little while, but listen to what he says to Daniel at the very end. He says, but go your way till the end, and you shall rest, and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of days. Daniel was a smart man. Daniel was a blessed man. Daniel didn't get to know everything, and he didn't need to. All he needed to really do was be faithful and know that God was in control and God was going to win in the end. It's much like the book of Revelation. There's a lot of difficult things in the book of Daniel. It's worth wrestling with them. I think it's important to wrestle with them, but at the same time, there's a very simple message in the book of Daniel, and that is those themes. One, God's sovereign. He's in control. He controls history. He knew what was going to happen with the Medes and the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans. He knew all the opposition his people were going to face. His plan was going to come about. He is in control. That should be humbling. It humbled Nebuchadnezzar. It humbled Belshazzar. Unfortunately, the worst way, it had to be his destruction. But we must humble ourselves before God's almighty hand. But also, the way we do that is faithfulness. Daniel saw a future that was not return from Babylon and everything is great. He saw a return from Babylon and things are going to still get really ugly for a while. And they were. When you read the intertestamental, what happens in that period, why is it that there's a Roman occupation when we get to the New Testament and meet Jesus? There's a whole history there that's bloody, that's violent, that's painful. God's people had to endure some suffering for a while, much like Revelation speaks of. But be faithful. As Jesus would say in Revelation, be faithful until death, and I will give you a crown of life. I want to make one more point, and I'll be brief about this before we close. I thought about making this point with all the others, but I wanted to save it to this one since this is the end of the major prophets. I've been enamored the last year or so as I've read through Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel and doing these overviews. It's a very interesting time in biblical history because God's people are exiled. And we have these 3 incredible prophets, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel and Daniel, all of whom overlap to some degree in their lives and their work with one another. And I've often thought about how different their circumstances were. You think of Jeremiah is in Jerusalem. He doesn't have to be exiled. We saw in Jeremiah his own countrymen beat him and arrest him and throw him in a cistern and try and kill him. He's kidnapped and taken off to Egypt at the end of his life. But then you've got Ezekiel, who isn't as mistreated as Jeremiah, but he lives most of his life as a refugee by a dirty canal in a pagan land instead of worshiping and serving in the temple that he was supposed to be a priest in. And then you've got Daniel, who, let's face it, may seem like he had the plush job. He's in the capital city. He's with the royalty. But look at all the politics and intrigue and dangers that he faced, probably constantly, and we just have a few of those stories. All three of these men had very different circumstances, and God used all of them where they were needed. And I bring that up as we come to an end of the major prophets to say to us, we all have very different circumstances. We're at different points in our lives, different points in our families, different talents, different abilities, different strengths, different weaknesses. But all of us can work for the kingdom. And our work may not look like everybody else's work. Daniel and Ezekiel and Jeremiah were three vastly different prophets who all served the kingdom. But they were faithful and they did what they could where they were. And if every one of us will just be faithful and do what we can where we are, the kingdom will grow. Not because of us, but because of the God that we're serving, who is sovereign and in control. It simply falls to us to be like these great examples, whether life is easy or whether life is very, very hard, to be faithful until the end. So that brings us to the end of the major prophets as we conclude that overview of the book of Daniel. I hope that it's been a helpful introduction and foundation. Again, I encourage you to go and read and study this book further on your own.